The first time my dad banned me from Christmas, he didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't even raise his voice. He just looked at me across the dining table and said I wasn't welcome anymore, like I had violated some rule no one ever told me existed. If you believe family silence can cut deeper than cruelty, stay with me. And subscribe if you know sometimes exclusion teaches lessons belonging never could. It started with a decision I made when I was 26, a normal one, at least I thought it was. Jake had crashed another car, second one that year. No injuries, thankfully, just a late-night mistake that ended with a dented hood and a breathalyzer test he barely passed. My dad wanted to handle it quietly, like always. Pay the repair shop, call in a favor, make it disappear. Family protects its own, he said. But this time, there was more involved. The other driver was a single mom. Her insurance didn't cover everything. She was already working 2 jobs. Jake wanted me to help smooth it over, because that was my role, fixer, mediator, the responsible one. Except, this time, I said no. Not dramatically, not angrily, just calmly. I'm not going to pressure her to drop the claim. Jake stared at me like I had just switched languages. Dad's expression hardened. It's just paperwork, he said, meaning just make it easier for him, just make it go away, just be useful again. I won't lie to her, I replied. The air shifted instantly. Not loud, not explosive, just cold. Jake laughed first. You're seriously choosing some stranger over your own family? No, I was choosing not to manipulate someone who didn't deserve it. But in our house, those 2 things were the same. Dinner ended early that night. No shouting, no slammed doors, just distance, the kind that settles in quietly before it becomes permanent. 3 days later, my dad called. We need space this Christmas, he said. Not punishment, not anger, just a boundary, framed as maturity. You've created tension, he added. Tension, like refusing to cover for someone was an emotional offense? I'm still coming, I said, because at the time I believed family didn't revoke belonging over disagreements, that love wasn't conditional. You shouldn't, he replied, and that was the first ban. I showed up anyway, with a bottle of wine, a wrapped sweater for Diane, a model car for Jake. Ironic in hindsight. When I knocked, the porch light flicked on. Diane opened the door halfway. Her voice was gentle. We talked about this. I'm not here to argue, I said. She hesitated, then stepped outside and closed the door behind her. We're trying to keep things calm, she whispered. Inside, I could hear music, laughter, plates clinking, life continuing without me. You can't come in, she said. Not cruel, not emotional, just decided. And behind her, through the narrow gap before the door shut again, I saw my dad walk past without even looking. That was year 1. I told myself it would pass, that once things cooled down, once Jake moved on, once Dad realized I wasn't attacking him, I'd be back. But the ban didn't lift. It evolved. Year 2 came with a text. Let's keep the holiday low stress again this year. Year 3 came with silence. No invite, no mention, just absence. At first, I tried. I sent gifts, neutral cards, thinking of you. I kept the door open even when mine had been closed, because I believed something simple. If I stayed kind, consistent, helpful enough, they would let me back in. And I stayed helpful. Of course I did. When Dad's store struggled during a slow quarter, I reorganized vendor payments. When Jake needed help refinancing his loan, I reviewed the paperwork. When Diane's sister needed legal referrals, I made calls. All without ever stepping inside on Christmas again. That was the part that took me years to understand. I wasn't banned from family. I was banned from comfort, from celebration, from belonging, but never from usefulness. Year 4 was when the story shifted. Not because of them, because of me. That December, Jake called, casual tone, like nothing had changed. Hey, can you look at something for the business? Of course. I said yes, because saying no still felt like betrayal. When I arrived at the shop, the problem was bigger than expected. A supplier dispute, contract exposure, financial risk, the kind that could spiral fast. I worked late into the night restructuring options, not for money, not for recognition, for family. As I packed up to leave, Jake said, "Thanks, seriously." And for a moment, I thought, maybe this was how things came back together. Then he added, "Christmas is still going to be small this year, though. Just information. No apology, no invitation." And that's when it hit me. They didn't see exclusion as punishment. They saw it as consequence. I had violated the rule, loyalty before integrity. And until I corrected that, belonging was suspended. But still, I kept showing up, because part of me still believed that being needed would eventually lead to being wanted. Year 5, year 6, same pattern. I was called for solutions, not celebrations. Advice, not presence. Stability, not connection. By year 7, I stopped pretending it was temporary.
By the 7th year, I had learned to measure my family's needs like a spreadsheet. Every call, every favor, every late-night problem solved had one hidden pattern. My usefulness had a shelf life, and they controlled the expiration date. Jake called mid-November, unusually tense. "Dad wants everyone involved this year," he said. "He's talking property, the business, everything." "Including me?" I asked, carefully. "Yes," he admitted. "Your input matters." I paused. 7 years of bans, 7 Decembers of silence, and now input was the word that mattered, not my presence. I didn't respond immediately, not because I doubted my skills. I knew I could handle the business side better than anyone there, but because I wanted to feel what it was like to be needed, not just assumed. Over the next week, I quietly gathered documents from old files I had maintained secretly, contracts, vendor lists, debt schedules, projections I'd drafted years ago that Dad had never credited me for. Every spreadsheet reminded me of how invisible my labor had always been. When I finally sent my proposal, it was clinical and precise. Restructuring suggestions, risk mitigation plans, alternate suppliers. Nothing emotional, nothing familial, just results. Within hours, Jake called. "This is formal," he said. His voice carried that mix of awe and unease. "It has to be," I replied. "Otherwise, someone will screw it up again." My dad joined the call minutes later, voice tight. "Do we really need this level of detail?" "Yes," I said evenly, "because you've been operating on luck for years, and luck isn't sustainable." For the first time, Dad didn't argue. He knew I was right, and he could feel it. They were silent for a long moment, and then Jake muttered, "Okay, we'll go with it." The room's tension lifted, but not with relief, with acknowledgement. I wasn't just the invisible daughter anymore. I was essential, but essential on my terms. Paid, accountable, recognized. I realized then that the years of exclusion had shaped me into someone who didn't need approval to operate effectively. They thought shutting me out would shrink me. Instead, it had built patience, precision, and confidence. 2 weeks later, Diane texted carefully, "We'd really love for you to attend Christmas dinner this year." I stared at the words. 7 years of absence and now an invitation framed as a gesture of reconciliation? I didn't reply immediately. I didn't need to. This wasn't about mending relationships anymore. It was about recognizing the power dynamics. They needed me. I didn't need them. That night, I sat at my apartment, reviewing the proposal again. Every recommendation had been accepted. Every potential mistake I had anticipated was now avoided. The business, once shaky and reliant on my silent labor, was finally secure under a structure they had only agreed to because I demanded it. And I finally understood. The ban, the exclusion, the silences, the unacknowledged labor, all of it had taught me to operate independently, to know my worth, to make decisions for myself. The invitation for Christmas could come, but it didn't matter anymore. Not my call, not my choice, and not my need. As December approached, I noticed Jake's calls became more hesitant. He started asking for updates on vendor responses, project timelines, financial projections. He hadn't confronted me about past behavior, hadn't acknowledged the years I was excluded. Instead, he tried to reclaim control by subtly reminding me of the urgency and the stakes. I let him talk. I listened. I provided updates, but I no longer worked to be liked or forgiven. I worked because I chose to, on terms that made me untouchable. Dad stopped calling altogether. He emailed weekly with requests wrapped in professional language, not parental concern. I realized the years of silent bans hadn't made me powerless. They'd made me untouchable. They couldn't manipulate me with guilt anymore. Even Diane, the perpetual mediator, texted occasionally, soft and careful. "We really hope you'll come." I ignored it, because I learned the invitation wasn't about me, it was about appearances. It was about optics, about showing a facade of reconciliation when they really wanted was control. Meanwhile, the business stabilized under the structure I implemented. Every potential crisis they didn't anticipate, I had accounted for. Every weak spot, every dependency, every overlooked contract was now managed, and for the first time, Jake and Dad could no longer claim credit for luck. They had to acknowledge planning, accountability, my expertise. At the end of November, I reflected on 7 years of excluded holidays. The gifts left on porches, the silent refusals, the calls that went unanswered. The sense of rejection had been real, the pain had been real, but now, sitting in my quiet apartment with soft light spilling over my desk, I realized I had grown beyond it. I didn't need them to restore my sense of belonging. I didn't need their approval. I didn't even need their acknowledgement. All I needed was to be myself, the same person who had been invisible, now indispensable. And when Christmas approached, I would decide whether to attend, not because they asked, but because I chose.
The first week of December passed with little fanfare. I continued my work, coordinating with suppliers, reviewing contracts, and monitoring the business metrics I had put in place. Each completed task reinforced a quiet realization. The family thought they could exclude me, but they had underestimated the lessons those years had taught me. Jake texted midweek, "Dad says he'd like to see the new projections in person." I didn't answer immediately. 7 years of silent treatment had taught me that urgency doesn't equal respect. I scheduled a meeting for the following day, not at the house, but at the office where I now had authority. When I arrived, Jake was already there, fidgeting with paperwork like a teenager waiting for a lecture. Dad followed shortly after, moving slowly, as if weighing every word before he spoke. Diane lingered behind them, careful and polite. I laid out my updates methodically, risks assessed, suppliers diversified, debts rescheduled, margins optimized. Every detail accounted for, every potential pitfall highlighted. Dad interrupted once. "Are we really that exposed?" "Yes," I said plainly, "and if no action is taken, you risk more than just the bottom line." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. We thought things were under control." I did too, until I reviewed the actual numbers. For a long moment, the room was silent. My authority was unspoken, but it was palpable. The shift had occurred quietly, almost invisibly, the way all real power often does. Then Dad leaned back and said, almost reluctantly, "All right, let's follow your recommendations." The words weren't praise, they weren't acknowledgement of the past, but for the first time, my input was treated as indispensable, not optional, and not as a favor. Later that afternoon, Diane texted again, "We're really hoping you'll come for Christmas." I stared at it, amused. 7 years of exclusion had finally culminated in a formal invitation, but this wasn't about healing old wounds. It was about optics, their need to show unity and control. I didn't respond. Instead, I returned to my office, reviewing vendor reports and reconfiguring timelines. I was calm, precise, deliberate. This was no longer about emotional belonging. It was about my agency. A few days before Christmas, Jake tried another angle. He called. "Wouldn't it be nice to have you there?" he asked, with a hint of defensiveness. I let it hang. I didn't say yes or no. I simply replied, "I'll decide when I get there." He sighed, frustrated but silent. When the day arrived, I made my choice deliberately. I wasn't stepping into the house. I wasn't attending under their terms. I wasn't subjecting myself to 7 years of inherited patterns and unspoken rules. Instead, I rented a small room at a local restaurant. Cozy lights, long table, warm atmosphere. Invitations went out to my colleagues, former clients, and a mentor who had watched me grow over the years. People who valued me for what I did, not what I was expected to endure. We shared food, laughter, and stories. I realized in that moment that belonging isn't about shared blood. It's about shared respect, acknowledgement, and choice. And for the first time, I felt entirely free of the unspoken debts I had carried for years. Meanwhile, back at the family house, Jake and Dad went through the motions. The Christmas tree gleamed, presents were exchanged. Diane smiled carefully, trying to maintain the illusion of harmony, but the power dynamic had shifted. Without my presence, the business had been stabilized structurally by me, and they had no way to claim credit. Jake sent me a text. "We missed you." I read it. I believed he meant it. But missing someone doesn't erase the patterns of 7 banned Christmases. It doesn't undo years of exclusion, silence, and undervaluation. I didn't reply. Later that night, Dad emailed, "Your work has been invaluable this year." No warmth, no mention of the band, no acknowledgement of the emotional history, just recognition of output. Transactional, distant, exactly what it had always been. And I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel hurt. I felt clarity. The ban had taught me independence, patience, precision, and self-worth. I didn't need acknowledgement anymore. I didn't need approval. I didn't need to be invited. All I needed was to operate on my terms. And now I did.
Christmas Eve arrived quietly in the city. My apartment was lit with soft fairy lights. A small pine wreath hung on my door, and the smell of baked gingerbread lingered in the air. There were no gifts to wrap for my family, no last-minute apologies, no need to justify myself to anyone. For the first time, I felt entirely untethered from the patterns that had defined me for over a decade. Diane's invitations sat in my inbox, polite and deliberate. "We hope you'll come for Christmas dinner this year." I stared at it, letting the words hang. 7 years of exclusion, and now they wanted participation. Not connection, not reconciliation, just participation. I didn't reply. I didn't have to. This wasn't about proving myself anymore. It was about deciding what I wanted. The truth settled quietly. They hadn't invited me to Christmas for years, not because of me, but because I had violated their unspoken rules, rules that valued convenience, appearances, and selective loyalty over integrity and honesty. My refusal to manipulate, my insistence on fairness, my refusal to enable Jake's recklessness had earned me silence and absence. And in that absence, I had built something stronger than their approval, myself. I could feel the old pull, the conditioning that kept me showing up when I wasn't wanted. But this time, it didn't have power over me. I wasn't the girl who begged for entry, who believed usefulness equaled love. I was someone who understood boundaries, and that understanding had cost them something invisible: control. Instead of driving to their house, I booked a long table at a quiet restaurant downtown. Cozy lights, warm music, people who knew me for who I was, not for what I could do for them. My mentor from college joined, a former client who had become a friend, and 2 colleagues I trusted deeply. We laughed, we shared stories, and we celebrated in a way that had nothing to do with obligation. This was inclusion by choice, respect without conditions, and I felt the kind of warmth that never came from my family. Meanwhile, across town, my dad, Jake, and Diane went through the motions. The tree glowed, presents were exchanged, and polite smiles were maintained. But their dynamic had shifted subtly. Without me physically present, The power I had wielded quietly through my work remained. The business was now structurally sound, my systems in place, my strategies implemented. They couldn't take credit, couldn't manipulate, and couldn't ignore it. Jake texted me, "We missed you." I read it and believed him. But missing someone doesn't erase years of exclusion. It doesn't undo repeated silences or the emotional weight of being banned from your own family's celebrations. I didn't reply. I didn't have to. That night, an email arrived from my dad. "Your work has been invaluable this year." No warmth, no recognition of the emotional cost, just acknowledgement of output. Transactional, distant, exactly as it had always been. And I didn't feel resentment. I didn't feel hurt. I felt clarity. The last laugh had been quiet, imperceptible but real. It wasn't about showing up to their table, proving I could be indispensable, or reclaiming what had been withheld. It was about living a life defined by my terms, choosing inclusion instead of waiting for it, and finally understanding that my absence didn't diminish me. I didn't need their recognition, their apology, or their gratitude. I had already won by growing beyond their rules, by building autonomy, by valuing myself over convenience. The invitation could have remained open and I could have walked away, or I could have ignored it entirely, which I did. Because the real power shift didn't happen at the table. It happened in the quiet moments leading up to it, in the years I stopped asking for approval, in the moments I refused to manipulate or enable, and in the life I built while they tried to control what I could give them. I glanced out the window at the falling snow and smiled. For the first time in my life, the holidays were mine. I was untethered, independent, and free, and that was the last laugh. No drama, no confrontation, no loud declaration, just a life fully lived, exactly how I wanted it, without anyone else's permission.